Hello, and thank you for joining me on week 3 of my series of gender, sexual, and relationship diversity short talks. This week I'm talking about sex and sexuality within the context of diversity, and I'm hoping that everybody shall be able to take something away from this week that's helpful on your own personal journeys. Again, I refer back to the week 1 introduction talk, where I explained that on the final week of October, following the 4 planned short talks, I'll be answering any questions that you have based on the content of this GSRD series. So as a recap, here's my email address in the next slide. Should you wish to ask a question, with a reminder to keep the questions general and not personal, please, so I can address them in another brief presentation. So I shall keep the questions, or rather the sender of the questions, anonymous too. So to continue from the idea of considering labels from where we left off thinking about gender in week 2, let's first look at labels that are used to describe sexuality or sexual orientation. Perhaps the most commonly known labels are lesbian, gay or homosexual, straight or heterosexual, bi or pansexual, and asexual. There are many, many more. And as always, I encourage that one makes no assumptions about the user's definition or experience of any particular labels. But perhaps that doesn't help us in the first instance in gaining understanding of this topic. So you guessed it, I'm going to take you right back to basics. This is my preferred model of understanding sexuality, and I'll try and keep the model in view whilst I describe it to help visualise this concept. This is a very useful model to first of all consider our own sexuality, and once we've done that and have a grasp of how this model works, it can then be used to understand sexuality in a wider context. So as we look at the model, we can see the 3 components of sexuality and how they can overlap. We have social identity, fantasy/desire, and behaviour/practice, in no particular order or importance. The circles can also be of different proportions, and crucially, when we use this model to consider any one person's sexuality, we must remember that this is a snapshot in time and that there may be fluidity or change over time to how one identifies or what one experiences. So for an example of how to use this, I might socially identify as asexual. I'm clear I don't wish to have sexual relations with romantic partners, of whom I am attracted to any gender. So choose other people identifying as asexual to date with the understanding that there shall be no sexual exchange in the relationship. I might also have homoerotic fantasy and sexual desire. In behaviour, I might practice solo sex and masturbate when alone in private. I could choose to label myself in a number of ways, but the social label, asexual, feels best fitting, and I also might use queer depending on the context. To provide another scenario, I might socially identify as a gay man who is active on the dating scene and enjoys having as many sexual partners as possible as the opportunity presents itself. In fantasy and desire, I might think about group sex and BDSM with people of any gender. In behaviour and practice, I might in fact be waiting for the right partner to settle into a monogamous, committed relationship with, and not be engaging in sexual activity with anybody else at the current time. My social persona is different to the real me, and I'm comfortable with this. A third example could be, I might socially identify as a heterosexual married woman who is in a monogamous marriage with my husband of 30 years. In fantasy, I might desire a threesome with my husband and another female. In behaviour and practice, I might be having sexual relations with another man outside of my marriage, as well as my husband, but I've not as yet had the fantasy sex with another woman. The social side of my identity is the only public information I choose to give, the rest is private. So we can see that the possibilities are endless here, and I encourage you to consider the model from your own unique perspective. This is not a binary model, and nor is it a spectrum, but a way of helping us understand the wonderful richness of sexuality and the possibilities within this. This model is particularly useful when adolescents are feeling pressure to figure out their sexual orientation or identity and are feeling stressed by labels and confusing and mixed feelings. It's all very normal, and there's no tick list or diagnostic criteria for LGBTQ identities. Nor do we become lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or sexual, or confused through awareness and understanding of relationship, sexual, and gender diversity. In fact, evidence shows that well-informed children make healthier and less risky choices and engage in sexual activity at a later age than those who do not receive comprehensive relationship and sex education. Again, you might want to reflect on this from your own early sexual experiences and think about where you've received your sex education from. It's never too late to learn, and there are some fantastic resources out there if you know where to look. My absolutely favourite one-stop shop that lists everything you could ever need to guide you in safe and sound, all-inclusive relationship and sex education for all ages and stages is sexpositivefamilies.com, and I'll show that slide at the end again just to make sure you've got this resource. This is a brilliant site run by my colleagues from the Sex Education Alliance over the pond. If you're a parent or somebody working with young people and families, I encourage you to take this opportunity to get your knowledge up to speed so that you can support children and young people in their RSE learning journey, which normally horrifies teenagers to know, does indeed continue throughout our adult years and into old age. Some of you may have seen the recent Davina McCall documentary in the menopause. It really highlights the lack of education on this huge developmental stage affecting so many lives and families, having a significant impact in sex lives. And as for the andropause, it's almost unheard of, but it exists and we need to know about this stuff. It affects us all. Sex, along with death, religion, and politics, has long been considered a taboo subject, although happily not round my dinner table. But this means that we very often aren't talking openly about sex, and this can become incredibly unhealthy. There are so many myths out there as to norms, and as with gender, many ideas that we falsely absorbed and adopted as truths that have been wrongly fed through history and society. Even when we consider anatomical correctness, there are still far too many people who call the vulva vagina and who think the clitoris is a tiny pea-shaped gland rather than the spectacular organ reaching out 7 centimetres that it is. As I mentioned in week 1, the most common definition of sex is penis and vagina penetrative intercourse, yet this is just one form of sex. Many of the ideas we have around sex fall into a very binary heteronormative narrative where the male orgasm is given utmost importance and female pleasure, attraction and desire is seen as far lesser and harder to achieve than the mighty male. What we actually know from science is that there are far more similarities than is commonly believed in the bodies belonging to people of all genders. You can read more about this in a book I would thoroughly recommend for all adults to read, especially if you're interested in future-proofing your own sex life and understanding more about the truth of desire. Dr. Karen Gurney's Mind the Gap is an excellent guide on these matters and I highly recommend reading this book. What I'd really like for people to take away from today's short talk is the importance of talking about sex. The most important sexual organ is the brain, and we've all got one of those. Good sex is all about communication, boundaries, and consent. I call it psychologically safe sex, and it's got to start by us being able to talk about sex. To look at it in another way, if we don't talk about it and define sexual acts and what our boundaries are, then there are blurred lines and we can't be certain of consensual behaviours from ourselves or others. Those who partake in kink and BDSM tend to be very good at communicating. There are often safety words and agreed rules and roles within this form of sexual interplay. Communication's paramount. But I'm jumping the gun a bit there, because as with relationships and gender diversity, the first point of exploration must start with the self. Our relationship with our own bodies and exploration of pleasure, desire, fantasy, passion, excitement, all of those things that make us feel good, as well as those that don't. It's all to be discovered and to learn from our own bodies and minds. It is an empowering journey, and being able to communicate and express our sexuality can be a liberating and ultimately gratifying experience. There are many, many ways to have sex, and one's sexuality does not define what kind of sex one might engage in. For example, it's a common misconception that asexual people do not have sex. Many people that identify as being asexual do have sex in various forms and for various reasons, such as pleasuring a partner or making a baby. Another example is that there are plenty of heterosexual identifying people who enjoy anal sex. We're not defined by any one aspect of our sexuality, and there's no rule book, except for the law, of course. But what that means is that it's all the more important we know our own bodies and minds, our own desires and boundaries, and our own sexual expectations, so that when finding sexual partners, we're engaging in a psychologically safe level. So I'll leave you with some questions to further explore your own unique experience of sex and sexuality, and also repeat the slide for sex-positive families for your resources. Thanks so much again for joining me in week 3 on sex and sexuality.